The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome everyone. This is Travis McGrath from Exago. I'm happy to bring you guys another of our continuing Exago support labs. Every month we do one end user and one basic lab to provide insights into both our front end and our more technical integration capabilities. So just to make sure everyone can hear me all right and to give the last few folks signing in a moment to get their audio set up. If you can hear me, you'll see in the right-hand panel of your screen, there's a questions box. If you could just type a yes or a thumbs up in the questions box. Great, I'm seeing some of you here. So at any point throughout today's presentation, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to type them in there. A couple of my colleagues, Nick and Emma, will be moderating. They'll try to answer them, or if they're more generic and we can open it up to the group, they'll jump in and ask on your behalf. The other thing I should mention here, like all of our support labs, this is being recorded, so it will be available on our support site for viewing later. You'll get an email as well as a survey after the lab, so you can give us feedback. We actually got a couple of great lab topics for later based on some of that feedback, so we really appreciate if you can take a moment to do that. All right, enough with the introductions. Today we're going back to what we're considering the basics, the real core of Exago, in terms of the single sign-on capabilities. So we're going to look at a live case example of a .Net API and a REST API integration. Now you may say, well, what's an API? So this is going to be a fairly technical lab. We're going to get into some code, but I want to give everyone sort of a base level. So the API is the way that the host application that is integrating Exago sets the permissions on behalf of the user for the session of Exago. So it's how Exago is launched, passing all those users permissions so that they see the appropriate reports and data without them having to sign in again. Now, there are actually 4 types of APIs. Today, we're just going to be looking at the .NET API and the REST-based web service. We do also offer a SOAP-based web service, but as SOAP is a technology that's sort of fallen out of fashion, we're not going to cover that here today. And we have a JavaScript API, but we're going to save that as a dedicated lab of its own in the coming months. So with that, the other thing I want to mention here is just a basic view of the architecture. So the user is always going to come in through your host application. The host application is going to authenticate the user, so they're signing into your application, and you know who they are. And the basic concept here is that we're going to always start out by initializing an Exago session. That's going to load a base set of configuration settings that are covered in our admin console. But then we can make specific changes for that user and that session. So we can activate roles to control what data they see. We can change the UI, the various features and capabilities, as well as control the reports. Now, you can call either the REST or the SOAP-based web services, and those are really wrappers sitting on top of the .NET API. So the key concepts, just very briefly, before we dive into the code, is that the first call is always initializing that session and loading that base configuration from the admin console. Subsequent API calls are going to make changes to that session, and that session, those changes are only going to apply for that individual user for that individual session. And the key here is that our last call is going to get a one-time use token, and we're going to use that to launch Exago. So now you may say we're going over 2 APIs today, the .NET and the REST. You know, what's the difference? So .NET is a type of coding environment. So .NET will be limited to .NET languages, particularly C#, which is what the examples we're going to look at today are going to be in, or things like VB. The power of the .NET API, and the reason if you're programming in these languages, we may recommend it for you, is that it can access any Exago setting at all. So it's really the same engine that our application layer is built on top of. The one limitation here in the .NET is that the host application must be able to directly reach the Exago web server, so they have to reside fairly close together. The REST offers a little more flexibility, so you can code in any language that can make REST calls, and if that's a web standard, it's really about programming in any language you want. It does have some limitations in terms of calls and some overhead, making web service calls instead of core calls here. However, it grants you some server independence. So the host application and the Exago server can reside in very different locations so long as they are able to connect via these web service calls. So that's really it for now. So it's time to jump over. And before we see code, I just want to sort of illustrate the point of what we're showing here. So we have a host application. We did visual changes to it for the time of year. But the idea here is that this is your core application, and your user logs in. And when they do, you now know who they are, so you can provide to them any interface for launching Exago as you choose, be it direct execution of reports or pulling up our full UI. And now this will happen seamlessly, right? All I had to do was click a button to launch the full UI, and the API has already been called. It started the session, set my specific user permissions, and launched Exago here into the container on the page. So what just happened between that click and this popping up, that's the code we're going to look at. So before I do that, I just want to pause momentarily and check with my colleagues. Are there any questions that should be opened up to the group here? Okay, I don't hear any questions coming in, so that's good. We'll carry forward and we'll start to look at code. And we're going to start out looking at the .NET code, the .NET API here. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and I'm just going to give it a little bit of a zoom here. So that we can, there we are, so that we can see the code a little bit better. Everyone can see it nice and large there. So we're going to jump into the code and look at it from the point that we already know who the user is, they've already signed in, and now they've clicked one of those buttons to tell us that they either want to run a report or to launch the full UI or open one of our designers. And so all that information is going to be stored up here. So this is us sort of building out what they're looking for in terms of a query, as well as the menu here. And really what we care about is this string. So this is a key that our website is designed to tell us what does the user want to do. And this is the first API call. So here we're building out an API object. And we'll show you what that API object right now, of course, it's just unassigned, but we're going to build that out in just a second. Now, what we're doing is we're going to jump back and forth between some helper methods, because we have our code nice and modular. So what we're going to do is say, based on what the user wants to do, we're going to, first of all, build a new API object. So I'm going to jump into the definition of this method. And the first thing it's going to do here is it's going to instantiate a new session with Exago. So it builds a new API object, and it passes in two values. One is the path to the Exago application, so it's where to find Exago. And the other is for that user, what config file should we load? So this is in our admin console. You can build different configurations if you have very different users, and you can load them dynamically based on that user. So this is going to start our base configuration, loading up the settings we've made in the admin console already. Now, the next thing we want to do is set a role, and this is going to help us control what data is available to the user. So all of these helper methods here, we're always going to set properties of the API object. Now, just to show you a neat part about this API object, particularly if you're working in Visual Studio, is that you have IntelliSense, right? So you can go through and see what properties are available. You can make changes to that object, and those changes will persist for the session. So, but for now, we're going to go and look at changing the role. Now, roles in Exago are used to manage a couple of properties, but the big focus for us is going to be on what data objects a user has access to. So the first thing we're going to do is the host application here is going to reach back to the database and say, for this user, what is that user's permissions, right? and we're going to keep that in a data set. And specifically, in this case, this data set just contains a list of the data objects that the user should or should not have access to. Then we're going to create another Exago object here. This one is called a role, and so we're basically going to start out by building a new role. Now, if we built some roles in our admin console, you could instead load an existing one and make specific changes to it or activate it. But I like starting from scratch here, so we're going to build a new role entirely dynamically. And on that role, we're telling it to include all folders. We're going to use folder management later on for roles, so that's not a concern here. Sorry, for permissioning of report access, so that's not a concern here. And then we're also going to specify whether or not the user can allow management of folders, so whether they can change, add, and rename folders. And again, we're using this Exago user object, which we already have because we know who the user is, to specify whether or not they should have that property. Now we're going to look at the data objects this role can control. And within the security, we have a data object setting called include all. So this says whether or not to include all data objects. And again, based on the user's existing permissions, we can set that. But then from the permissions we got from our database earlier, and it doesn't have to be a database. Of course, this could be using something like Active Directory, wherever you want to store your user permissions. We're going to make a simple for loop, and we're just going to loop through all the data objects that that user has permission to. And we're going to add these data objects to the role. So we're going to create a data object and add it to the role. So the role security data object collection, we're adding a new object. And we're setting that object's name to match the stored permissions in our system. And if we want to do row level filtering, we can also use this role to set dynamic SQL here that will always append to the where clause of any query that a user is sending from a report. So this allows us to do some dynamic row level filtering per user. So I just want to pause here for a moment and see, are there any questions about setting a role? Okay, great. I don't see any questions coming in. Again, the important part here is that this role is being created for that individual session and then set dynamically. And of course, we're going to activate it. Now that we've made all these changes, we can return that API object, go back to our main method. So here we've instantiated the API session. Now we've activated a role. The next thing I want to do, or we want to do, is we can set some parameter values. And parameters are essentially a placeholder for values in the Exago application that we're going to use for various either extensibility features or for things like the scheduler. So the important ones here are that we're going to set a parameter that contains the user ID and the company ID. Now these are precisely named case-sensitive parameters, and they help us identify the user. We're actually going to add a couple of additional parameters here that we can, you can specify really as many as you want, and you can use them for whatever you'd like. So these are some for various extensibility features we want. And I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper and show exactly how those parameters are built. So what we're doing here, we made another helper method to set a parameter value. And we're essentially saying, in the base configuration of Exago, look at the parameters and get this particular parameter. If it doesn't exist, add this parameter. If it does exist, set its particular value. So get the parameter, set its value to the new value. So this is our helper method for doing that. And we can see this here. We're saying, look at the user ID parameter. If it exists, set its value to this user's ID. Otherwise, add this parameter and give it the value you want. Now it looks like there was a question, so I'm just going to pause to bring up the questions there. Nope, not false alarm there. Okay, great. So we've set the role and we've set the parameters. The next thing we can look at is some general settings. So in the admin console, if you've worked in setting up Exago before, you know we have a large number of general settings, and you can change a huge array of them. So whether it's changing the user's language or enabling or disabling various features, these are all available through the .NET API, so you can change them easily here. And of course, these are based on the user-specific settings. So whether you want users to be able to schedule reports, for example, is just a simple line here that says enable scheduling, and then true or false, we just set it to a Boolean value. Beyond that, we can set the Exago style. Last month in our support lab, we looked at making application themes, and this is where we can set those application themes. So in this case, we are setting those via the API here. So we can say, API general CSS theme, that's the application theme. And we can set those to match whatever theme is appropriate for that user. And then in our case, we're doing some slightly more complex things here. We're setting some of the config, some API settings from our app config. So this is something we do for deployment internally. I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but you can go even farther here. You can set data source connection strength based on the user, or really any other setting in Exago. So this is how we build our API object. Once we have our API object, we're almost done. We only have to make a few more calls. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to set this API action. And the API action is a value that tells Exago when it launches what action to take. So in this case, we're setting it to say home, that is to say show the full Exago UI. But of course, you may want to directly execute a report, edit a report, add various types of new reports, or schedule reports, or open our scheduler manager. So we have about 10 actions here, and this list is regularly growing. So in all the cases, whatever the user wants to do, we're always setting these two properties. So we're always getting the API and setting the roles and the parameters as we mentioned, and then we're setting the action. From there, in some cases, for example, if you wanted to say execute a report, you would have to, of course, load a report. So what we're doing there is we are getting our API object and setting all the permissions we already mentioned, but then we're also loading a report object. So the report object here, again, we can go into a helper method, but the helper method, quite simply, is api.reportObjectFactory.load from repository. So here we're just specifying the report we're trying to load. Going even deeper, if we want to, we can do things like change the export type. So we can say we want to send a report to PDF or Excel or anything like that. And we have various other settings. But the important part is once we've set the action and maybe loaded the report in the case of editing, running, or emailing reports, from there, what we want to do is we want to launch. And this is our last API call. We're going to call this API get URL param string method. And this method gives us a one-time use token that we can use at the end of a URL. And then we can either launch a new browser window or a container on our page. So in this case, we're using an iframe. Now, for the folks who may be saying, wait, I don't want to use iframes, that's okay. That's exactly what we've created our JavaScript API for. And as I alluded to, we're going to save that for a full separate lab in the future as well. So at this point, that's really it. Once this iframe source is set, it will go back to the client side and load Exago with all of those users' permissions. So we did exactly what we mentioned. We instantiated an API. We set a bunch of user-specific permissions, including building a dynamic role. Then we, if we wanted to, change the action and loaded a report. And then importantly, we made this one-time call to get URL param string that locked in our session and gave us this token that we can use to launch Exago. So I want to pause here and see if there are any questions. Great. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is offer a little bit of an interactive question here. So we're going to look at the same concepts, but instead of using the .NET API, we're going to use the REST API. Now we can do this in a couple of ways, and since it's language independent, we have examples in both C# and I have an example here in PHP. So I guess my question to the folks on the call, in the chat box in the questions there, if you have a strong preference one way or the other, I'm just going to pause for about 30 seconds. Give a C# or a PHP, and we'll pull up code accordingly. All right, so it looks like the C# folks are winning out. For the folks interested, we can send out the PHP example, and most of these examples are in our documentation as well. So those are something we can show later on. So for the C# example, we're going to do something a little easier. So we're going to come in again to our application where we already know who the user is and what permissions we want to set. And in REST-based web services, the key here is the type of calls that we're going to be making and the endpoints we want to call. So to start with, we're going to make a post call. Post calls create objects. So we're going to build out our HTTP client. These are some .NET objects that are used to make REST calls. And we're going to call the API, and we're going to tell it to post a session. That is to say, create a session. So we're telling it to post, and specifically, we're telling it to look at the sessions. And we're going to call the API. So we're going to build out our URI here. So it's REST/our endpoint. Now, if we want to, we can change the config dynamically, just like we did with the .NET API. And since this is our initial call, we're not going to worry about passing in a session ID because we don't have one yet. So that's going to do an asynchronous post call back to the Exago web API. Now I should mention, of course, for the REST API to work, it is a web service, so it does require we install the API in our installer. You'll see a couple of options as well as the Exago installation itself. So when that call comes back, that's going to initialize our session, again, reading that base configuration. And we're going to store from that call a session object and get the ID for that session. So this is how we're going to tell it which session to make changes to with our subsequent calls. Oh, you know what? Let me zoom in a little bit just to make sure everything's nice and visible. So here, once we have the session created, we can make patch calls. These are going to make adjustments to particular values. And again, here we can use parameters such as user ID and company ID to store specific values. Now this is a much simpler example, so we're only setting these two parameters, but again, you can set as many as you'd like. This time, of course, in addition to saying the type of method we want to call, and the and the endpoint here, so being parameters and the specific parameter we want to change, we're passing that session ID to say we want to make this change for this specific session. Now, from there, we can also create a role. So what we can do is, in this case, maybe we're not going to create it, though we could. Instead, we're going to patch an existing role. So we're going to make another patch call. The endpoint here for our REST is going to be roles / and the name of the role, passing in the session ID we want. And then in the body of the web service, we can make JSON to set any property. So in this case, we're keeping it fairly simple. We're just calling the isActive, and we're just saying to activate a particular role. We have a helper method here that's letting us get data sources, so we can look up specific data sources. And then we can make patch calls later on to change data sources as we want. Now, we're doing some sort of tricky things here with the configuration manager, but the important part is once we decide how we want to set the data source connection string, for example, we do that again with a patch call, this time to a data source endpoint, specifying the data source's ID, the session, and some JSON to give us our connection string and the value we want to set it to. From there, we can make some other additional calls. We can make additional calls. So for example, if we want to modify the session to tell it that perhaps we want to execute a report, we have our session object. We can create a new one, and we can set the API action within that session, as well as various other settings. So whether or not we want to show tabs or error detail. And we can set report settings. So this will allow us to create an object that contains the name, execution type of reports. And what we'll do is we'll make a patch call down here, again to the session, but this time giving it the ID of the specific session we want to change. And in the body, we're going to pass the session object that we created up here as a JSON object. So that's going to pass in the values of what API action, tabs, area detail, all those sorts of things, as well as the report settings. So this is going to be the name of the report that ought to be loaded. So here we can call that in a patch method as well. Now, the neat part is in the REST API, you don't actually have to make a final call to get that token. From the initial session, you'll have that token in its body. So it's called the app URL. So we can pull that app URL from our initial call or really any subsequent call and use that again to set as a container, in this case, again, an iframe. But again, if we wanted to avoid use of iframes, we can launch in a separate window or use the JavaScript API in conjunction with the REST, which, as I alluded to, will be a future lab. So I just want to pause there on the REST API. So it's very similar in the flow, but instead of working with native .NET objects, we're making asynchronous calls to the web across the web using posts, patches, and occasionally gets to create and set various values for that specific session. Great. So I don't see any questions coming in. I will mention that the API are very powerful. There's a lot of documentation on our support site about all of their capabilities because I've just given sort of a brief overview today for this code sample of the basic flow in a very standard case. But you can do some very complex things if you have inherent user logic and things like that. So with that, what I want to do is just as a quick mention, if you are interested, next month our support labs are going to be on the 8th and the 22nd. On the 8th, we're going to be using our technical lab to talk about vertical tables and multiple data models. So these are some neat ways Exago can be set up to handle non-tabular data or to allow for multiple data models of joins. On the 22nd, I'm very excited to say that one of my colleagues will be hosting our end user lab, and they'll be giving an overview of the new enhancements in our 2017.2 release, showing off the dashboard experience, which has been renovated and greatly improved. I'd offer you guys a sneak peek, but I don't want to steal the thunder from my colleague there. Our 17.2 release will be coming out right at the beginning of next month, and we're very excited for it. So with that, I want to give one more opportunity for any questions on the API so far. And then as it doesn't look like there are any coming in. Oh, wait, we have a last minute question. So the question of, is there a specific date for the release? I believe the date for the 17.2 release is going to be on, let me check. I believe it's the beginning of the month, the first of the month, but I will have to verify that with my product management team. And then how does the session info tie in? So this is a great question. In many of our extensibility features, such as folder management, server, or action events, there is a session info object that Exago will pass to those extensibility handlers. So the session info object is going to be the effective configuration of the session. So that is to say, all of the base configuration of the admin console and any changes that have been made through the API. So the session info object allows you to pull parameter values that were set by the API and use those within your own extensibility code. We've talked in past labs a couple of times about custom functions and action events and server events. Those are examples of the session info object. There's certainly other places that it can be used, such as folder management, so it'll come up in future labs as well. That was a great question. So with that, we've just reached the bottom of the hour. So I want to say thank you very much for coming with us today and looking at these two overviews of the API launch sequence. If you do have any other questions, please always feel free to email services@Exago. We're always happy to help out there, and we hope to see you at next month's lab. Thank you very much.